9 years, 4 months, and 11 days. That's how long I served before a general, with 3 stars pinned to his collar, told me my career file was one of the 7 he'd trust with his own daughter's life. And 2 weeks after my husband's funeral, my mother-in-law stood in a lawyer's office in Tampa, Florida, and told the room I was just a secretary who got lucky marrying a lieutenant colonel. If you're watching this from a base, from a courtroom parking lot, or from a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, because grief doesn't let you sleep, and you know exactly what that particular silence sounds like, comment where you're watching from, hit like, and subscribe, because what happened in that Hillsborough County courtroom 11 weeks later is the reason I stopped explaining myself to people who never once asked what I actually did for a living. My name is Rachel Ann Kessler. I was 34 years old the week my husband Marcus died, and I had spent the previous 9 years and 4 months as a major in Army Medical Intelligence. A title so quiet, so deliberately unremarkable on paper, that even Marcus's own mother, Diane Whitfield Kessler, a retired schoolteacher who had raised 2 children alone in Ocala, Florida, believed for 11 straight years that I simply filed his paperwork for a living. That was Lupe, the first thread pulling at the edges of everything that came after: an estate battle over Marcus's assets, his share in Kessler Aerospace Consulting, and a house on Bayshore Boulevard worth $1.1 million. And my mother-in-law's lawyer, a sharp-suited man named Peter Voss, had already filed papers to have me declared unfit to inherit, on the grounds that a woman who played soldier behind a desk had no real claim to a decorated officer's estate. Loop B was quieter, and it had started long before Marcus's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning at Tampa General. It started 3 years into our marriage, the first time Diane looked at my uniform hanging in our hallway closet and asked, in front of Marcus's sister, whether the Army let just anyone wear the Eagle rank now. Marcus never corrected her. Not once. In 9 years. He'd laugh it off, squeeze my hand under the dinner table, tell me later in private that his mother didn't mean anything by it, while never once explaining to her what redacted lines in my personnel file actually meant. Never once telling his own family that his wife had briefed 2-star generals in rooms without windows. And Loop C, the one that would take the longest to close, was this: a sealed envelope, cream-colored, government stamp faded at the corner, sitting in the bottom drawer of my home office since the day Marcus was diagnosed with the heart condition that would kill him 4 months later. He'd told me, hand trembling around his coffee mug, "If anything happens to me, you open that." Not before. I hadn't opened it. Not at the hospital. Not at the funeral. Not even the morning Diane's lawyer served me with papers, questioning my mental competency to manage a dead man's estate. Marcus and I met at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, in a briefing room that smelled like burnt coffee and cold air conditioning. He was a first lieutenant then. Logistics, loud laugh, the kind of officer everyone wanted at their table. I was a captain, assigned to a unit whose full name never appeared on any organizational chart he had clearance to see. We didn't discuss my work. That wasn't secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was law. It was oath. It was the kind of silence you carry, the way you carry your own spine. Invisible, but load-bearing. Marcus respected that silence for exactly as long as it was convenient for him. In private, in the dark, in the years before his mother's voice found its way into every family gathering, he'd trace the 2 silver oak leaves on my dress uniform and tell me he was the luckiest man at Fort Sam. In public, at Thanksgiving in Diane's dining room in Ocala, Florida, he'd let his mother call my 9 years of federal service Rachel's little government job and say nothing. Marcus's father had died when he was 19, and Diane had raised both her children, Marcus and his younger sister Caroline, alone, on a schoolteacher's pension, in a 3-bedroom house she still owned outright. She had built her entire identity around being the woman who sacrificed everything so her son could become an officer, and I understood, even then, that a woman like me, one who outranked her son within 5 years of marrying him, one whose service record required a security clearance Diane herself didn't have the paperwork to legally ask about, was a threat to a story she had spent 3 decades telling herself. There was a specific dinner, Marcus's 40th birthday, at a steakhouse on Dale Mabry Highway that I still replay sometimes without meaning to. Diane raised a glass and toasted. My son, who built a real career out of nothing, unlike some people who just found a good man to attach themselves to. And the entire table, 12 people, candles, the smell of seared beef and red wine, laughed politely, the way families do when a joke lands somewhere between cruelty and habit. Marcus laughed too. I remember the exact texture of the linen napkin in my lap, the way I folded it once, twice, 3 times, and said nothing, because saying something would have meant explaining classified operational details to a table of relatives with 0 security clearance, over dessert, which was never going to happen. The labels stuck the way labels do when nobody with the truth bothers to correct them. Secretary, desk job, paperwork girl. Diane said it at Christmas dinners, at Marcus's promotion ceremony to lieutenant colonel in 2019, even at the hospital the week before Marcus died, leaning toward Caroline in the waiting room at Tampa General and murmuring, loud enough for the nurses' station to hear, that at least Marcus had real accomplishments to leave behind, unlike some people. I sat 4 feet away in a molded plastic chair, my husband's heart monitor beeping through the wall, and I said nothing. 9 years of classified briefings teach you exactly one transferable skill for civilian life: the ability to let an insult pass through you without your face ever confirming it landed. Marcus died on March 14th at 6:52 in the morning, 4 days after his 41st birthday, from a cardiac event his cardiologist had been monitoring since November. I was holding his hand. The room smelled like antiseptic, and the stale coffee in the paper cup I'd never gotten around to drinking, and the monitor made a sound I still hear sometimes, at exactly 6:52, no matter what clock I'm looking at. Diane was in the hallway, having stepped out for coffee 12 minutes earlier, a detail she would later, astonishingly, use in front of her lawyer to suggest I had somehow orchestrated the timing of my own husband's death to be alone with him at the end. When she came back into the room and saw the flat line on the monitor, she didn't look at Marcus first. She looked at me, standing there in yesterday's clothes, 3 days without real sleep, and she said, "What did you do?" Not a question, a statement, delivered the way you'd address a subordinate who'd broken protocol. I didn't answer her. I signed the paperwork the hospital needed, called the funeral home Marcus and I had discussed 11 months earlier when his diagnosis first came in, and drove myself home at 9 in the morning with the radio off, because that was the moment I understood exactly what kind of fight this was going to be. The funeral was on a Saturday, and by the following Wednesday, Peter Voss, a probate attorney with an office on Kennedy Boulevard, a closet full of tailored suits, and a well-earned reputation for squeezing widows dry in exchange for a third of the estate, had already filed a petition with the Hillsborough County Probate Court. Diane was contesting the will, not amending, not questioning a single clause, contesting the entire document on the grounds that Marcus's last will, updated 8 months before his death, naming me as sole executor and primary beneficiary of both the Bayshore Boulevard house and his 40% stake in Kessler Aerospace Consulting, had been signed under circumstances raising questions of undue influence. Her filing used the word manipulation 3 times. It used the word military 0 times, as though 9 years of my life could be erased from a legal document simply by declining to mention it. My own attorney, a measured, silver-haired woman named Elena Marsh, who had handled military family estates for over 20 years and kept a small folded flag from her own late father's service on the corner of her desk, sat across from me in her office on Bayshore and slid the filing across the table with 2 fingers, like it might be contagious. "She's arguing you coerced a dying man," Elena said. "That's a serious claim, Rachel. We need to fight this hard, and we need to fight it with everything you've got. Your marriage records, character witnesses, anyone who can speak to your relationship, your service record if it helps establish credibility with the judge." I remember looking at the sealed envelope in my mind, the one still sitting in my desk drawer 4 miles away, and telling Elena, calmly, that I didn't want to submit anything about my military service. Elena's pen stopped moving. "Rachel, that's exactly the kind of thing that could turn a judge in your favor. A decorated officer's testimony carries weight. I told her I understood. I told her no, anyway. What Elena didn't know, what almost no one outside a 12-person clearance list knew, was that my service record wasn't simply private. Large sections of it were legally sealed under a classification review that wouldn't lapse for another 6 years, tied to intelligence sharing operations I'd conducted between 2015 and 2021, involving casualty pattern analysis for forward medical units in contested regions. I couldn't submit it as character evidence even if I wanted to, not without a formal declassification request, routed through channels that moved at the speed of government bureaucracy, which is to say, not fast enough to matter in a probate hearing scheduled 11 weeks out. So when Voss's court filing described me, in writing, as a woman with no verifiable independent income history or notable professional accomplishment prior to marriage, I had no immediate way to correct the record. The pre-trial conference was set for a Tuesday morning in May, courtroom 4B, in front of Magistrate Judge Warren Okafor, a man Elena described to me as fair to a fault and allergic to theatrics. The night before that pre-trial conference, I finally opened the drawer. I sat on the floor of my home office in the dark, the cream-colored envelope in my lap, Marcus's handwriting across the front. Rachel, only if. And I turned it over 3 times without breaking the seal. Inside, I already suspected, was the one document that could end this instantly. A sworn, notarized letter Marcus had asked his commanding officer, Brigadier General Thomas Aldrich, to prepare 18 months earlier, after Marcus first learned about his heart condition, specifically anticipating a fight exactly like this one. I didn't open it that night either. Some part of me, the part that had spent 9 years learning that information deployed too early loses all its power, understood that this envelope wasn't for a pre-trial conference. It was for the day Diane stood in a courtroom and said the quiet part, out loud, in front of witnesses, where it could never be walked back. The pre-trial conference in courtroom 4B lasted 40 minutes, and Diane spent most of it staring at me across the aisle, with an expression I'd catalogued 100 times over 9 years. The particular blend of pity and contempt, reserved for people who don't know they've already lost. She wore a cream Chanel-style suit, pearl earrings Marcus had bought her for her 60th birthday, and when Judge Okafor asked, procedurally, whether either party had military affiliation relevant to asset division, Diane leaned toward Voss and said, not quite as quietly as she believed, she was never a soldier. She was a secretary who married up. Okafor didn't react. I didn't react. The fluorescent lights in courtroom 4B buzzed faintly overhead, and somewhere behind me, a bailiff's radio crackled once and went quiet. But I felt Elena's hand tighten briefly around her pen beside me, and I filed the sentence away, exact wording intact, the way I'd once filed enemy troop movements. Because in my experience, people who underestimate you say the truest version of what they believe when they think no one important is listening. Elena leaned over during a brief recess and whispered, "You could ask the court to note that comment for the record." I told her not yet. She studied my face for a moment, the way people do when they're trying to decide whether calm is a strategy or a symptom, and then she nodded once and let it go, trusting, correctly, that I had a reason. Caroline Whitfield Reyes, Marcus's younger sister, arrived for the second hearing in June, wearing a designer bag that cost more than my monthly army pension check, and made a point of sitting directly behind Diane, arms crossed, offering me a smile so thin it barely qualified as one. Caroline had never once, in 9 years, asked me a single question about my deployments, my rank, or what I actually did between 2015 and 2021. What she had asked, repeatedly, at every family gathering, was whether I planned to get a real job once Marcus made partner at Kessler Aerospace. A question delivered with the specific, practiced condescension of someone who has never once had her own competence questioned by a room full of relatives. In the courthouse hallway that June morning, waiting for our case to be called, Caroline said to her mother, just loud enough for me to hear, over the sound of a floor buffer 3 doors down, "I still don't understand how Marcus married someone with literally nothing to show for herself." I stood 8 feet away, examining a courthouse bulletin board covered in fading notices about jury duty and courthouse parking regulations, with the kind of stillness that had once kept me alive in a briefing room where the wrong facial expression could cost an operation. The buffer machine 3 doors down kept humming its low mechanical drone, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that it was the only honest sound in that entire hallway. I said nothing. I have learned that silence, held long enough, makes people say more, and Caroline, emboldened by my lack of response, added one more line to her mother that morning. Honestly, I give it 2 years before she remarries someone equally boring. A comment so small and so revealing of exactly how little either of them had ever wondered about who I actually was, that I nearly laughed out loud. Right there, in front of the bulletin board. Peter Voss, for his part, treated every hearing like a performance for an audience of exactly one, himself. He was a compact man in his 50s with a habit of adjusting his cufflinks before every objection, and by the 3rd hearing in July, he had escalated his written filings to describe me as someone who had strategically obscured her background to appear more sympathetic to the court, a phrase so absurd, given that I had submitted nothing about my background at all, that Elena actually laughed out loud reading it in her office. Voss's real skill wasn't legal reasoning, wasn't case law, wasn't precedent. It was momentum, pure and simple. He filed motions the way some men send emails at midnight, more interested in volume than substance, betting correctly that a grieving widow, with no living parents of her own, and a 9-year career built on secrecy, would eventually run out of stamina to keep fighting a war of paperwork. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that stamina under sustained pressure, with no visible reward, was the one skill the United States Army had spent 9 years training directly into my nervous system. If you've ever sat in a room being underestimated by people who mistake your silence for weakness, type, "I know that feeling," in the comments right now. Hit subscribe, and stay with me, because what Diane said in the final hearing is the sentence that ends up destroying her. But before that hearing, there was one more thing I had to face, and it hurt worse than anything Diane, Caroline, or Voss had said in 5 months of filings combined. Going through Marcus's home office in August, boxing up files for the estate inventory Elena's paralegal needed, I found a folder I hadn't been looking for. Correspondence between Marcus and his mother going back to the year we married. Emails. Printed because Diane distrusted digital records and Marcus, apparently, kept paper copies of everything, the way his mother had taught him. In one email, dated 4 years into our marriage, Diane had written, "I don't understand why you don't just tell people what she actually does, instead of letting them assume, unless there's a reason you'd rather they not know." Marcus's reply, 11 minutes later, read, "It's easier this way. People ask fewer questions if they think she's just admin. And honestly, Mum, sometimes I like being the one with the impressive career in the room. Is that so terrible?" I sat on the floor of that office for a long time, with that email open on the laptop screen, the same floor where I'd later hold the sealed envelope in my lap. 9 years. 9 years of watching my husband let his mother diminish me at every holiday, every promotion, every hospital waiting room. And it hadn't been oversight, or conflict avoidance, or a man too tired to correct his difficult mother. It had been a choice, a quiet, repeated, 11 years running choice, to keep me smaller than I was, because my actual size made him uncomfortable in front of his own family. I want to tell you I cried. I didn't. 9 years of classified work teaches you that grief and rage, when they arrive together, are best processed somewhere private, later, on your own schedule, not on the floor of a dead man's office with a probate deadline 6 weeks away. What I felt instead was something colder and more useful. Clarity. Marcus had built the box I'd been living in. Diane had simply been standing outside it, mocking the woman she assumed lived there. And in 18 months, right after his diagnosis, Marcus had apparently decided, quietly, without telling me, the way he'd decided everything about my visibility in his family for a decade, that if he died, the box needed to come off. That was what the sealed envelope was. Not an apology, a correction, timed for maximum effect, exactly the way I would have planned it myself. I finally opened it on a Sunday night in September, 3 days before the final hearing, at the same kitchen table where Marcus and I had eaten dinner 900 times. The house was quiet in that specific way. Houses get quiet after someone dies in them. Not silent, exactly. Just missing the particular register of a voice that used to fill it. I ran my thumb under the seal slowly, the way I'd been trained to open anything that might matter, and the paper inside smelled faintly of the cedar box it had been stored in for 18 months. My hands, which had stayed steady through 5 months of Diane's contempt and Voss's filings, were shaking slightly by the time I unfolded the second page. Inside was a single sworn affidavit, notarized on the 11th of November 2 years earlier, signed by Brigadier General Thomas Aldrich, my former commanding officer during the years I ran casualty pattern analysis for forward medical units. The letter was 2 pages, dense with the kind of clipped, formal military language I hadn't heard directed at me in over a year, and it confirmed, in explicit terms cleared for civilian disclosure, that Major Rachel A. Kessler had served 9 years and 4 months of active duty, had received the Bronze Star for actions during a classified operation in 2018, and had been directly responsible for intelligence work, credited with reducing preventable combat casualties across 3 forward operating bases by an estimated 31%. Attached was a second document, a formal notice from the Department of the Army's Classification Review Office confirming that, given the death of the service member's spouse and pending litigation, a limited declassification had been authorized specifically for the purpose of legal proceedings, effective the following week. Marcus had done this 18 months before he died. He had contacted General Aldrich directly, requested the affidavit, and initiated a formal declassification request through channels that normally took years, and somehow, using whatever remained of his own connections at Kessler Aerospace, which did significant contract work with the Department of Defense, had gotten it processed in under 6 months. He had built the exact tool that would dismantle his own mother's contempt, and then he had died before he could hand it to me himself, leaving only 4 words on the outside of an envelope. Rachel, only if. I called Elena that same night. She was quiet on the phone for almost 30 seconds after I read her the affidavit's second paragraph aloud. Rachel, she finally said, this isn't just character evidence. If Voss is arguing undue influence on the theory that you're an unsophisticated woman who manipulated a dying man, this evidence doesn't just refute that. It obliterates the entire premise of his case. We spent the next 2 nights preparing. Elena wanted to file the affidavit immediately as a supplemental exhibit, formally, through the court's electronic filing system, time-stamped and served on opposing counsel 48 hours before the hearing, exactly as procedure required. I agreed to the filing. What I didn't tell her, what I'd decided alone, on that kitchen floor, holding 4 words in my husband's handwriting, was that I wasn't going to say a single word about it in the courtroom until Diane gave me the opening herself. Voss would see the filing, he'd know it existed, but I was betting that his ego, and Diane's, would be too large to actually read a 9-year-old military intelligence officer's Bronze Star citation as a warning, rather than paperwork to be dismissed. Elena tried once more, the morning of the hearing, standing outside courtroom 4B, with 2 coffees in her hands, one of which she handed me without asking if I wanted it. You don't have to wait for her to walk into it, she said. We could open with the affidavit. Control the narrative from the first minute. I took the coffee, black, too hot to drink yet, and told her I appreciated the instinct, but that I'd spent 9 years learning that the most useful intelligence is the kind your enemy hands you voluntarily, in their own words, on the record, because they underestimated the room. Elena studied me for a long moment in the fluorescent hallway light, then nodded, the same way she had months earlier, and said, "All right, Major, your call." It was the first time anyone outside that Veterans Support Group had used my rank in almost a year, and something in my chest settled, quietly, before we walked in. Courtroom 4B was fuller than usual that final Tuesday morning in September. Elena had quietly reached out to 2 people in the week before the hearing. General Aldrich, who flew in from Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and sat in the 3rd row in civilian clothes, his posture giving him away regardless, and Marcus's former commanding officer at his own Army Reserve unit, retired Colonel James Ferris, who came as a character witness Elena had listed weeks earlier, before either of us knew the affidavit existed. There were also 4 or 5 veterans from a support group I'd quietly joined 8 months after Marcus's death. Women who'd shown up, they said, because nobody should walk into a room like that alone. Diane arrived in navy blue this time, Caroline beside her, Voss adjusting his cufflinks in the aisle. The air conditioning hummed too loud, the way it always does in Florida courthouses in September, and I could smell floor wax and old paper and, faintly, someone's coffee 3 rows back. Voss opened strong, reading from a prepared statement that recycled every phrase from 5 months of filings. Undue influence, strategic obscuring, no verifiable independent accomplishment. Judge Okafor, folder closed in front of him, let Voss finish without interruption. The particular patience of a man who has learned that some arguments are best allowed to collapse under their own weight. Then Elena rose and calmly, formally, entered Exhibit 14 into the record. General Aldrich's affidavit, the Bronze Star citation, the Department of the Army's declassification notice, and asked that it be read into the record in full, given its direct bearing on the credibility claims opposing counsel had repeatedly made about Mrs. Kessler's background. Diane leaned toward Voss, and this time she didn't bother lowering her voice at all. "This is theater," she said, loud enough that 3 people in the gallery turned. "She's fabricating something to look sympathetic. She was never a soldier. She was a secretary who married up, and now she's using a dead general's signature to steal what's rightfully mine." The words landed in the exact silence Marcus's mother had spent 11 years perfecting in family dining rooms. Except this time the silence belonged to a courtroom, and General Thomas Aldrich rose from the 3rd row before Judge Okafor could even respond, requesting the court's permission to address the affidavit's authenticity directly, under oath, right now, if the court would allow it. He stood with the same posture I remembered from a windowless briefing room in 2018, shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides, a man who had clearly decided, the moment Diane spoke, that he wasn't going to let a probate courtroom in Tampa be the place where 9 years of his own operational judgment got publicly dismissed as fabrication. Judge Okafor allowed it. Aldrich walked to the stand in a plain grey suit, his shoes echoing across the polished courtroom floor, was sworn in, and in 4 sentences, confirmed his signature, his rank, his 9 years commanding Major Kessler directly, and the exact operational context of the Bronze Star citation, an extraction of wounded personnel from a compromised forward position in 2018 that Major Kessler had coordinated under direct fire, an action that, in Aldrich's own words, the entire brigade still discusses as one of the most consequential intelligence and logistics decisions I witnessed in 28 years of service. Somewhere behind me, one of the veterans from my support group let out a breath I could actually hear, and Colonel Ferris, seated near General Aldrich, nodded slowly, once, the small acknowledgement of one officer confirming another's account. Judge Okafor closed the folder in front of him with a soft, deliberate thud that seemed to carry across the entire room, looked once, directly, at Peter Voss, and asked a single question. "Counsel, do you have any evidence, any at all, supporting your client's claim that Mrs. Kessler fabricated her military record, beyond your client's personal opinion?" Voss opened his mouth. Nothing came out for 4 full seconds. Diane's face, beside him, had gone the color of the courtroom walls. She reached for her water glass and missed it by an inch, her hand trembling in a way I had genuinely never seen in 11 years of knowing her. And Caroline, behind her, had gone completely still, staring at the back of her mother's chair, as if she could somehow rewind the last 90 seconds. Judge Okafor ruled from the bench 19 minutes later, after a brief recess during which nobody in the gallery said a single word. The silence in that courtroom heavier and more total than any silence I'd carried in 11 years of family dinners combined. The will stood as written. I retained sole executorship, the Bayshore Boulevard house, and Marcus's 40% stake in Kessler Aerospace Consulting, valued at just over $2.1 million, once the full estate accounting was complete. He further noted, for the record, that opposing counsel's repeated characterizations of Mrs. Kessler throughout the proceedings had, in his words, raised serious questions about the good faith basis of this litigation. Language Elena told me afterward was as close as a probate judge gets to publicly accusing an attorney of malpractice, without actually using the word. The consequences arrived at different speeds for different people, the way they always do. Peter Voss was referred to the Florida Bar's grievance committee within a month, following a formal complaint Elena filed, documenting a pattern of unsupported factual claims across the litigation. He lost 2 other clients within the year, once word spread through the Tampa probate circuit, and Elena told me, months later over coffee, that a junior associate at his own firm had privately admitted Voss's case notes showed he'd never once verified Diane's claims about my background before building an entire legal strategy on top of them. Caroline stopped attending family functions that included me, which suited us both, though I heard secondhand, through a mutual cousin, that her own marriage had become strained under financial pressure I chose not to feel satisfaction about, though I noticed I didn't feel much sympathy either. Diane lost more than the lawsuit. She lost the story she had told herself for 30 years, that she was the woman who had sacrificed everything for a son who became something, married to someone who was, by her own repeated insistence, nothing. In a courtroom hallway, 6 weeks after the ruling, she found me alone, waiting for Elena to finish a filing, and for the first time in 11 years, she didn't speak first with contempt already loaded in her voice. She said quietly, "I didn't know. Marcus never told us the extent of it. I don't expect you to forgive 11 years, but I am sorry, Rachel. I was wrong, and I said things I can never take back." I told her I appreciated her saying it. I didn't tell her I forgave her, because I didn't, not fully, not yet. But I let her sit with me for 10 minutes on a courthouse bench, the marble cold even through my slacks. 2 women who had both loved the same complicated man, and both, in different ways, been shaped by what he chose not to say. Before she left, Diane paused, turned back once, and asked, almost shyly, whether I'd ever consider telling her, someday, what the extraction in 2018 had actually involved. I told her maybe. I meant it, though I still haven't, and I'm not sure yet whether that's protecting classified information or simply protecting the last small thing that's still only mine. I still visit General Aldrich's affidavit sometimes, not because I need it anymore. The ruling is final, the estate is settled, the house on Bayshore Boulevard is mine free and clear. But because rereading it reminds me of something I'd almost let myself forget over 11 years of small, accumulated silences. That the truth about who you are doesn't actually depend on whether the people around you choose to see it. It only depends on whether you're still willing to hold it, quietly, until the moment it matters. I think about General Aldrich's affidavit sometimes, sitting now in a fireproof box instead of a desk drawer, and I think about how close I came to never opening it at all, to letting Diane's version of me become the only version anyone remembered. I've learned that the people who sacrifice quietly are rarely the ones telling their own story, because quiet sacrifice, by definition, doesn't announce itself. It waits. It gets underestimated at dinner tables, and in hospital hallways, and in courtrooms, by people who mistake your silence for absence of substance. So I'll ask you what I've had to ask myself all year. How many people in your own life are carrying something you've never bothered to ask about, simply because they never made you ask? 3 months after that hearing, I got a call from a woman named Patricia Vance, a command sergeant major's widow in Jacksonville, whose late husband's business partner was trying the exact same move Diane had, and she'd gotten my number from someone in that veterans support group, because apparently my name had started circulating in rooms I didn't even know existed, attached to a story I hadn't told anyone outside that courtroom. She asked me one question before anything else. Did you know, the whole time, that the affidavit was coming? Or did you just have to trust him? I still don't fully know the honest answer to that question myself, and if you've ever had to bet everything on trusting someone who'd already let you down for 11 years straight, you already know exactly why I've never watched that folder close in Judge Okafor's hands without feeling my whole chest go tight all over again. The same tightness I felt the night I finally broke the seal on that cedar-scented envelope, not knowing whether I was about to find forgiveness, evidence, or just 4 more words that would mean nothing at all. Subscribe, because next week I'm telling Patricia's story, and what her husband's partner didn't know is so much worse than anything Diane ever said to me.